wanted to introduce you to Pam, who works at IPG. She is the one that sort of imports all of our titles from overseas. So when books don't see a US publication, she's kind of picking and choosing from those titles to bring over to the US because she feels there's a market for them.
Yeah, I feel like it's super exciting because it's so much of what I go into indie bookstores looking for is like that cool stuff. And Atlantic is a great publisher. I love working with them, and super exciting to have this book. We used to have Canongate, and had Nick's actual like sick bag stories.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites actually. Sick bag song, I think.
Sick bag song, yeah, that was amazing. Like just getting to handle those and have those in the office. And then Alan and Unwin, I think, had a photography book. Yeah, I feel like with just different Nick Cave things have come through, and I'm always like, I don't know why these aren't being picked up for rights deals, but better for us because it puts them at the top of our list. You know, it's kind of means it's the best of what we have. And we get to read them.
Yeah, well, hey, I really appreciate you all sort of supporting me and the book, and I'm glad that you like it enough to help get it out over there to people. Obviously, I put a lot of my life and energy into it, and I feel like I can still look at it and read it and even be surprised by it and think, oh, wow, actually did pretty good. So that's sort of pleasing as well. It hasn't sort of worn out its welcome. In a funny way, it feels like something not separate to me because I feel deeply connected to it, but I'm almost surprised when I look at it and think, oh, wow. And I kind of find I forget parts of the book because so much energy goes into it, and then I open it up and almost didn't know it myself. It's like some other thing. I'm sure lots of writers feel that way about their books, that it's both of them and apart from them. So yeah,
it's a big book. I could see why you feel that way.
Yeah,
and then
checks out.
Mark Larry Law is here also, and he's the director of the Great Lakes Independent Booksellers Association. So, and anybody else here, feel free to turn your cameras on or be incognito. Totally up to you. Let's get started. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and thanks to Mark especially. What time is it where you are? It's pretty early, right? It's morning where you are, Mark?
No, it's actually really quite pleasant. I was expecting it to be some sort of 5 a.m. do my push-ups and have a strong coffee situation, but it's actually 11 a.m. So I can't get too onerous, you know.
Well, yeah, so thanks everybody. We're here to talk about Boy on Fire, the young Nick Cave. Sorry, it's kind of blown out here. This version of the book came out about a year ago. Is that right, Pam? And it's coming out in a more trade paperback in just about a month.
I believe that's
right there. Yeah. This is definitely my favorite music book I read this year. And the thing that I was really struck by Boy on Fire is how Nick Cave made connections with friends and musicians that he worked with from teenage years till very, very, very recently, and continues to work with some of them. I kind of forgot about what a, sort of goth, crazy, wild kid he was, because it was so like kind of sweet, and everything with his dad being sort of a local hero school teacher was just very, very, I wasn't expecting to be so kind of heartwarmed by the story. And yeah, it was just a really great book, and was not expecting the story that you kind of uncovered.
Thanks.
So thanks. Super enjoyable. As I understand, it's a two-parter.
Yeah, I'm just in the process of negotiating or finalizing negotiations really for a volume 2, and that'll be kind of Nick Cave in London, Berlin and Sao Paulo. I did a ton of work for the book, and originally I was trying to do a full life, and I just collapsed under the weight of it really, but I've got just a wealth of material that I didn't use, and I imagine a lot of the people I spoke to would be thinking, what, I spent hours speaking to Mark and Nick Cave's still in shorts, what's happened? So I think I owe them a little bit more of the journey yet, and there's something kind of balanced like the other side of the door about that other period of Nick's life, which is when he was getting pretty wild, and he's really established himself as a solo artist. So I think that's a nice, yeah, they work really well together. So that's the next part. So stay tuned, come back to me in 2 years or so, see if I'm any grayer and more demented than I am already.
Well, I know you were going to read maybe a little bit of the intro.
Sure.
And then I think Javier and I both have some more questions for you, and maybe the audience as well.
Okay, cool, no problem. I'll just read from the very start. It's the prologue. It's called The Journalist and the Singer. And it's basically an introduction and sets the context for how I met Nick. It's probably not really true of the rest of the book, because this introductory section's first person from me, and then after that it's very much third person, observational, a lot more repertorial and detached. But anyway, hopefully you'll find this interesting for seeing how we collided. The Journalist and the Singer. The first time I ever spoke to Nick Cave was in a phone interview to promote his second solo album, The Firstborn is Dead, an ominous blues-affected work that sanctified the birth of Elvis Presley and thereby rock and roll itself in quasi-religious apocalyptic terms. Our conversation around the recording was dry as spinifex, so slow and spacious it sometimes ceased to exist. As if Cave could not be less interested in what I was asking or saying, and never would be. Given his notorious hatred of journalists back then, this made for an uphill experience. I put the phone down with sweating palms and a sinking feeling in my heart. What a failure. Dealing with Cave again, let alone meeting him in person, was not something I looked forward to. In 1988, I nonetheless lobbied to interview Nick Cave for Sydney's On the Street. Second time lucky, I must have been hoping. Face to face, he had to be more approachable than that distant voice on an echoing telephone line. Besides, he was the preeminent Australian rock and roll artist of his day. This made him hard to ignore. Cave was in town to read from and preview a much anticipated literary work in progress, a book that would become known as And the Ass Saw the Angel. He'd already gone so far as to declare himself more of a writer now, disowning rock and roll for its lowbrow qualities and Pavlov's dog audience responses. I was given a laneway address for a warehouse located directly behind Sydney's somewhat alternative and bohemian gay strip, Oxford Street. Cave was apparently holed up there with a girlfriend or a dealer or criminal acquaintance. Rumours varied depending on who I spoke to. As always with Cave, rumours were all around him, as if his every movement across town were hot-wired into the gossip chambers of inner Sydney conversation. The only other wave-making machine of this kind that I would ever know was Michael Hutchins. It was as if you could feel their presence rippling through the city from the moment their flight hit the tarmac and they entered, half in secret, into our closed little world. When I knocked on the door of what looked like an old garage, a key was hurled to the road with a vaguely familiar shout hovering invisibly on the Sunday afternoon air. As I let myself in, I heard footsteps on the wooden ceiling and the creak of a trapdoor above. At the top of the ladder-like stairs that rolled down to meet me with a thud, there was now a hole in the ceiling where Nick Cave himself stood, bathed in backlight. He beckoned me upwards like some awful figure in a B-grade horror film about a journalist come to interview a terrifying rock and roll vampire. I gulped and set forth on my way to meet my Nosferatu. Once I arrived upstairs, the atmosphere changed immediately. Cave was a solicitous host, while a young woman I took to his partner bossed him about as if I'd just entered a goth version of the British comedy George and Mildred. "Get Mark something to eat, Nick," she said briskly. A large serving of the very best fruits was put before me: grapes, lychees, melon, apple, all prepared and presented in a grand manner. As Cave was about to seat himself and enjoy some of his banquet, his partner said, "Did you offer Mark some coffee, Nick?" Again he rose, mock lugubrious, stick insect angular. He went over to an old metal funnel attached to a wooden workbench, poured in some coffee beans and began to slowly turn the handle. Grind, grind, grind. It's the story of my life. With a variety of expensive biscuits now also arrayed before me, I was soon thanking the couple for their surprising hospitality. Cave asked me why it should be so unexpected. An evasive answer seemed tactically unwise, so I mentioned the Prince of Darkness thing around him and his reputation for treating journalists poorly. "Who says that?" he asked a little surly. "Why, the NME, the New Musical Express," I began to say, in a reference to the influential British music paper of the day. "The NME," he barked. Kay began to grind the coffee beans with much greater intensity. His partner looked at me and said, "Don't get him started." To Cave, she called out in a calming voice, "Now, Nick." Cave ground on, taking it out on the beans. "The enemy." Yeah. So yeah, it was a daunting first effort, even though Nick turned out to be a very friendly and helpful guy. He did his best for me. So it was more comedy than horror, really, more comedy than horror. That was back in the 80s. And of course, I began the book about 30 years later, 20, 30 years later. And Nick was in a very different state. Clear as a bell, sharp as a tack, drug-free. Of course, he'd finally gotten himself free of heroin, married, a father, a very different beast. And just a great person to spend time with, really. It was an honor.
He seems pretty unprotected in this book. Like he seems like pretty open about everything that's gone before, but I wasn't there when you were drawing stories out of him. Did you feel that way? He doesn't seem, his persona certainly isn't super open. You don't know a bunch about him. He doesn't do a ton of interviews. He's prolific as hell, so you'd think he would be pretty used to being out there. But yeah, how did you find him to be in terms of like telling you personal stuff?
Well, I mean, you got to remember these conversations occurred over quite a duration of time, and there's a lot more than one conversation. There was a couple of days initially, about 3 days in full of us meeting and talking in Brighton where he was living. Then there were emails, phone conversations. I went on tour with Grinderman, did a few things with the Bad Seeds as well, smaller trips. Nick used to call me at random times as well at night. So, the openness grew. Nick is like a storyteller. So, we all tell stories about our lives that can be exaggerated or a little bit bent to heighten the telling or to suit us. but I felt I was lucky at the time that when I finally met Nick to do the book, which was around 2010, he was a changed person, and a lot of that the aggression and defensiveness of the early years that I allude to jokingly in that opening section had dissolved. I was lucky too. I was able to speak to a lot of other people. I spent a lot of time with Nick's mother. I spoke to Nick's brother Tim. I spoke to his sister. I spoke to childhood friends, to all the living band members of the Boys Next Door birthday party, the Bad Seeds, just incredible amount. Too many people, really. That's what got me into trouble. I overdid it. But it did heighten both the intimacy and also the ability to surround stories and get different perspectives and get a sense of the sort of social milieu and the cultural circumstances. And I mean, I'm just a year younger than Nick, basically a year or two. And so I've lived the same type of life in Australia too. So that gives you a kind of inner beat. So, I felt very familiar with a lot of the things he was talking about. But Nick and I got on great. I was lucky. Once he trusted me. I mean, I think you see that in his music too. His collaborative life with Mick Harvey and now with Warren Ellis, and with filmmakers like John Hillcoat and now Andrew Dominic more so. There's a lot of trust and a lot of generosity.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like a gang. I could see why you would get wrapped up in all the sort of peripheral characters.
Mm.
That really came through in the book, and I really liked that bit about it. They all seemed like supporting actors in the. That's
right. I mean, there's a sort of Dostoevskian side to Nick, which I make explicit in the nature of the biography. And you see it in the sort of mythological nature of his older songs. He uses a lot of those people and experiences in heightened ways to tell stories in music and in literature too, for that matter. When you look at a book like The Death of Bunny Munro, which is, I think, half about him and half about his father in a very exaggerated and absurdist kind of way, as well as about masculinity in a sort of hyped up manner and questioning it. But Nick's always sort of, I think, talking to his past, and particularly his upbringing in country Victoria in the town of Wangaratta, because that's a sort of dreaming site for him. And again, I mean, clearly we're all adults here. I assume like we know ourselves as we get older. Our formative being comes through our childhood and our teenage years, and it seems as we get older, it comes back to us all the more strongly. And you can do pop psychology and think, well, you're examining how it makes you, but I think it remakes you all the time too, as you dream it back to you. And artists in particular, in their songs or paintings, use it as a sort of a constructive force, even if it can be a little bit difficult at times.
Going back to your point a minute ago, everyone has an origin story, right? And as some more interesting than others, of course. But take us back to those early cave years in Wangaratta. His father taught English. He was an amateur thespian. His mother was a librarian at a local high school.
That's right.
How did that, or did it, in that environment, foster the creative side of the cave?
Well, I think it had a huge influence. I mean, you'll find in Boy on Fire that Nick's father was quite a titan himself, and if Nick hadn't become globally famous, he might have ended up being known, at least in Victoria, as the son of Colin Cave. Wangaratta is a very sort of interesting just region and town physically and historically. It's the home of the outlaw Ned Kelly, and the whole Ned Kelly story had a sort of big impact on Nick as a boy, and that would be kind of like living in the kind of hometown of Jesse James or Robin Hood. So that sort of occupies a kind of place in the imagination too for Nick. Because Nick's parents were so literary and musical and basically very sort of cultured middle-class people and very active in the community, that naturally sort of fed into sort of Nick's imagination as well. But he had the benefit of being able to sort of wander around Wangaratta and go up into the mountains shooting rabbits. And so there's that funny combination in Nick of the refined and the brutal that I think comes from that sort of country town upbringing. And there was a lot of clashes too between Nick and his father, which I outline in the book as Nick got older, and a kind of trauma that occurs when he's forced to leave Wangaratta because he's becoming basically juvenile delinquent, and the family decides to send him away to Melbourne to boarding school because he's just getting so unruly. And part of the reason for that unruliness is because he's an extremely intelligent boy turning into a young man, and I think he's just bored. But it's still very difficult for him, and he goes to boarding school in Melbourne, and there's bullying, and like a lot of boys' schools of that era, there's a kind of a culture of violence, actual and psychological. So Nick goes from this pretty idyllic, sort of sweet country world, that's also romantic, where he's having his sort of a crush, not a relationship, but a sort of romantic connection to his first female muse, if you like, who introduces him to Leonard Cohen. All these kind of very beautiful things. You can see it, like the chapter in Wangaratta, there's a beauty to it, but there's a sense of a world in danger or threatened. And then he's torn from that. His father in particular pushes him to Melbourne, and there's a real break. And that sense of a lost world, I think, affected Nick a lot. And you can hear Wangaratta, I think, in a lot of Nick's songs. Like a song like Sad Waters is very much about Nick's first love and time by the river. A song like Red Right Hand, if you go to the town of Wangaratta, you can almost see it as a mythical map of the town of Wangaratta, and the figure in the long dark coat, well, that could be Johnny Cash, or it could be Bob Dylan as early influences, but it's also both Nick's father and Nick himself, and some sort of version of death as well, maybe. So, there's all these associations there too. Funny enough, when I went to Wangaratta, I was sitting in a park near where Nick lived, between Nick's family home and the local swimming pool, just sitting under a big tree that he used to climb. And I'm from a suburban industrial town called Newcastle here, and I felt entirely familiar with this world. Like I knew this suburban semi-industrial landscape like the back of my own hand, and I was like, oh my God, like I know this place. And that was when I realized I could write the book too, that I had parallel experiences, and it also dawned on me too that I could do a portrait of the artist as a young man as early as that there was something to be said for portraying all the things that would stay with Nick for the rest of his life and return again and again in his songs.
Yeah, I feel like I never would have guessed how he grew up, because it definitely seems a reaction against something. And then reading the book, you kind of realize his dad, I feel like his dad's motivation was to like get him focused on something, and to kind of find himself. And you know, I mean, I would have guessed that it, you know, that he was like from a broken family, or, you know, just given kind of like his anger and rebellion and stuff. And it's pretty amazing to see like where he came from and what his kind of, I mean, it was just like being unchallenged and stuff. And yeah, it's pretty great to see
he was
that.
from a very nice, caring, loving, middle-class family. And he was just a very, very bright boy who was a real handful. I mean, there's reasons for that anger coming into the picture later on. And not least the death of Nick's father in a terrible car accident when he was 21, which is talked about in the book. That's I guess, the sort of first traumatic and motivating incident that really sends him on his way. I mean, he's already dabbling in drugs by then. He's already in a band, the Boys Next Door, that are the band that evolved into the birthday party and kind of launching. But for sure, like Nick's image now within the suits and the sophistication of it, he seems like a very European artist. And that was kind of nice too, to sort of recognize just how profoundly Australian he is, and how much the landscapes of Wangaratta, where he grew up in country Victoria, and then the whole Melbourne punk and post-punk scene of the 70s formed him, and the friendships, the social conditions, the people around him, and their passion for music and for art and culture. You know, you can sometimes put too much faith in the lone genius and forget how much they absorb from all these other incredible people too. He's just the most famous and hardworking, and maybe the best, I don't know, but certainly the most famous and hardworking out of a group of all these amazing people.
I mean, prolific. I just kept thinking like how prolific he is. But yeah, definitely, they were all like so unique and interesting in their own right. And yeah.
You know, well, I mean, you know, like to take a personality that he encounters in Melbourne, like Rollins Howard, the guitarist, is having something of a renaissance himself from a while back because of the documentary Autoluminescent, and now I believe there are releases of These Immortal Soul records, which are very fine pieces of kind of maverick rock and roll music with a dark kind of romantic edge. I mean, the partnership between Nick Cave and Rollins Howard was sort of seminal for that first phase of Nick's career towards the end of Melbourne with the Boys Next Door, and absolutely with the birthday party in London, and the sonics of it, as well as the lyrical directions. And you know, they were just a great band. You know, Phil Calvert on drums, Mick Harvey playing guitar and then moving on to drums and just about every instrument under the sun, and basically being Nick's main arranger, co-writer for the next 3 decades. It's all there in Boy on Fire, and it all comes out of basically a schoolboy band, yeah, which is what they were, as well as some pretty childish, wild, comical, crude behavior as well. That, you know,
that photo of him with his pants down is classic.
Yeah, he hates that. I know he hates that photo. He always looks at that photo and goes, "I hate that photo." So from, yeah, you know, well, you know, they were just wild young boys, you know. But it does get darker, and you can see in the trajectory of Boy on Fire that you move from this country state for Nick, where he's a very sweet, creative, kind of absorbing figure, you know. And then the whole lens gets darker in Melbourne, and there's the bullying, there's the machismo, the boys' school thing, the drugs begin to come into it. It gets much worse later again, and everything becomes more shadowy, and then Nick's father is killed in an accident, and that kind of is almost nuclear in its energy, the impact on Nick and how it occurs, and it sort of brings everything into this moment of trauma, and then it just explodes back out again, and Nick is on his way, and that's kind of where the book ends, with Nick leaving for London with the boys next door, and all his dreams and rages and kind of dream and nightmare vision in some respects in front, and that seemed a good way to end the book, with him heading into the world ready to take it on.
Just want to talk about his relationship with his father.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really great scene in the book. It's really touched as a parent of a combative but lovely 17-year-old. There's a scene where Colin said to Nick, when he had seen the boys next door perform for the second time at the Tiger Room, Nick was surprised to see him in the audience, and later Colin said that he looked like an angel up there.
Oh, yeah.
Given their combative relationship, that had to have had a pretty inspiring effect on, having been a son and been a parent. I know how those moments can go,
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a kind of running theme in the book. Nick's, this natural competitiveness, the boy competing with the father,
Mm-hmm.
father being just a brilliant but somewhat overbearing figure. And it was actually Nick's mother who told me that story. And I think she told it to me because she knew how much it affected Nick, and because it mattered to her too. Because it's a little bit easy, particularly in the present context where the conversations about toxic masculinity, de rigueur, to reduce people to singular cartoons, right? But of course, people can be horrible and beautiful. They can be tender and they can be cruel. All of us can be that way. And I would believe, from all I know about Colin Cave and have heard about him, that he manifested all those qualities as a parent. So that angel quote, you're right, is a really important one. And it was a recognition that Nick's work mattered, because prior to that, Colin had been very disinterested and even mocking of some of Nick's music efforts. I mean, and of course, they were a teenage band, and yes, there was some pretty kind of childish lyrics, and the punk behavior thing. Performing, I think the first time Colin Cave saw the band was at a punk festival that had been kicked out of a club, and it was held on the street in front of some warehouses called Punk Gunk. And the first time he sees Nick's rolling around in the gutter, singing, I think, a song called Sex Crimes. So naturally, Nick's father, a very refined opera and classical music loving buff, he's not going to be too impressed by that. So whereas the angel thing, I think, was maybe a year later, and the band had developed a bit more, and Nick was wearing all white and spotlit, and that was the love and the pride of a father coming through in just a very small but important statement. And it says something about Nick too. I mean, Nick has those strange sort of, it is, it's corny, but he's used it a lot in songs himself, that devil and angel kind of split, and he can still be like that. I mean, people kind of love the Red Hand Files and the monologues and the beauty and the grief and the sort of therapeutic and open communications that he's involved with now online. But there's still an edge in Nick, no doubt about it. And it would be sort of foolish to underestimate that dark side to him as much as the angel is more visible to us now.
Anybody else want to ask Mark a question? feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I was just thinking about how I feel like he's someone who has in his life and are leaned into vulnerability and like more and more. I mean, we all saw like the progression of how the ballads started happening, and then like the Red Hand Files feels like extremely vulnerable, and also I feel like it's a quality that lends itself to being a good collaborator. That kind of trust that comes with being open about yourself. And Red Hand Files in some ways feels like this huge ultimate collaboration that is like being open to anyone. And just seeing him like tell people, basically he'll make friends with people in those letters and be like, let me, you know, keep contacting me, let me know how you're doing. That one the other day when he was like, I bought some of your chocolate, which hopefully will not get every like entrepreneur writing him. Although it wouldn't be a bad tactic. Do you think that what do you think he still holds back?
Well, I mean, artists are strange creatures, aren't they? On the one hand, they use and reveal everything, and yet they mutate it and sort of submerge it and heighten it. So, you know, an artist is constantly revealing and constantly hiding in public and sending out both overt signals and communications and secret ones. You know, I totally agree. You know, Nick is far more open. He's obviously a very collaborative person, and that's a really interesting point, that the Red Hand Files is the ultimate collaboration because it's a public communication, and it obviously comes out of those monologue tours that he was doing, where he feels he talks directly to people. Although I would say Nick is still very much in control of that communication, in a way that he might not be with journalists. And a part of me would wish for a little more communication with journalists, as well as the Red Hand Files, to counterbalance some of that control, because it's still a cultivated as well as an open relationship. As to what he holds back, gee, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Nick just seems to always have more. And that's what's astounding about him. And he always is moving forward. So I have this sense at the moment that he and Warren Ellis have come to a kind of end of a musical phase. Like, I'm really glad to see that he'll be touring with both Warren and with the Bad Seeds, because I think I have this sense that a whole new door of music will open up yet again. I'll be interested to see if he continues to do the Red Hand Files. And the more Nick does, the more is unearthed, and the more there's this conversation going on between songs, between life experiences, between past and present, and obviously with his most recent music, between this world and the other world, because so much of it's happened in the wake of the death of his son Arthur, and there's a very strong spiritual dimension. So, yeah, what does he hold back? I don't know. I don't think it's so much a matter of necessarily holding back as just this immense sort of reservoir of life experience and pain now with the loss of his son and love, you know. I think it might be more a case of Nick sort of seeking new energies rather than holding anything back. So I'd be interested to see the possibilities of joy in his music, for instance. You know, that's perhaps an untapped reservoir for him. not an easy space or place to find, given all that's occurred in recent years. But I think Nick's reaching for it. I think too, I should actually say, sorry to suddenly jump in then after I'd stopped, but I think you can see that in the chapter I wrote in the book on Wangaratta, the boy that is so open and so like full of life and full of sort of sensuous and imaginative experience, and the sweetness, you know, that there is a sweetness there. So it's like there's the sweetness, and then this dark core formed around him as life went on, and he became the sort of goth, demonic figure that he became. And now there's a kind of corona of openness and generosity again, and you know, but back in the core, there's still that sweet being.
I also feel like that was a big part of like Grinderman, was like trying to get that excitement back, but it was also like, and trying to get that joy back, but it was also like an intentional hard edge, like an intentional kind of like pushing away. And I think a lot of what he did after that, especially, you know, like you said, with the sun dying and stuff, was much more somber and, you know.
Well, Grinderman to me is kind of on one level just about having fun.
Right. Yeah.
Cutting loose, and the stuff like I really love. Gustine is probably the most favourite recording that he's done for me in the last few, 5 years, 10 years. That I think is a masterpiece, and it's more like it's a death mass. It's a eulogy mass on a vast, poetic, and beautiful scale. And I don't gravitate to it easily. And I was listening to it only a month or two ago, and I was surprised how much I enjoyed it, how beautiful and pleasurable it was, and I had a sense somehow of it being darker or heavier, and there is some real heaviness in it, but it was uplifting, and very, very enjoyable to listen to. So that's another thing Nick's music does too. You come back to records and you think you know them, and you realise you hardly know them at all. And this is actually what caused me a lot of difficulty writing the book. I kept going down rabbit holes, not just with all the people around Nick and Nick himself, but all the influences and all the things that his songs contain. So it's this spider's web of vibrating connections and references. And it's a little bit like that movie, City of God, where they go into a room and you go down into the history of a room for the last 50 years, and there's one thing below another, below another, below another. And Nick's a very thoughtful composer and lyricist, as we know. So there's a lot to explore vertically as well as horizontally in his creative life.
Kristen asks if you have any music bio memoirs that you'd recommend, or are there any books or writers that influenced you and how you wanted to present Nick Cave?
Well, I guess kind of pretentious, but it was partly coming out of Nick's own reading at the time, like Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. Yeah, I mean, if you read Boy on Fire, you'll see there's probably about 20, 30 main characters across the book. So I had to present them, even if they only appeared 2 or 3 times in the trajectory of it, in a way that was going to be memorable, just on the basis of a description or a quote, and stay in people's minds. So that was just a writing challenge for me. And I wanted to have that sort of buzzing intensity as best as I could manage it. I'm just trying to think. There's Nick Tosh's book, Hellfire, is another beauty as well, particularly the opening sequence where Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley collide in this sort of pilled out hallucination. That was both funny and a bit scary, because I'd like to think Boy on Fire is a funny book, because you are dealing with young men having a wild and a good time as it goes on. So there's a lot of rough humor, but there's also an element of malice and troubling things that are going to intensify. So yeah, Nick Tosh's for sure. The Neil Young biography, Shaky, I really like. I'm a Neil Young fanatic, so, you know, and Dylan's Chronicles as well, particularly the sequence, which he never names, about the making of Oh Mercy, when he's riding a motorbike, and you feel like you enter into a dream. So I wanted those kind of, that scope and those sort of literary qualities, and to kind of balance, you know, my background as a journalist and all the reporting I did, all the interviews, all the information, with something much more kind of literary, and to make people feel like they are there, you know, that you are in Wangaratta with Nick, walking the streets and hanging by the river and looking at the night sky, and that you're there with Nick on the streets of St Kilda in Melbourne, you know, taking drugs, you know, dealing with more nastiness, you know, attitudes much more spiky, the music, the sort of hallucinogenic energy of the Crystal Ballroom, which was this sort of beautiful sort of decaying venue where an entire scene kind of swept in, and everybody kind of imagined themselves and dressed up as a kind of character and were trying to be somebody, and all the sort of friendships and the friction. I wanted that dream, that cinematic kind of feeling to it. So putting people in the situation was important to me, and I think Nick's lyrics, really, you know, like Nick's certainly been an influence on me, more so when I wrote the book, because I was listening to so much. So the lyrical qualities, the way he's able to create worlds, and you become part of that with very kind of precise imagery. I mean, he's clearly a great writer. So all of that kind of came into play, as well as the voices of everybody else. So they're almost like these sort of ghosts in the story, and in a funny way, it is almost a kind of ghost story. I guess all our memories of our lives are to some extent ghost stories that haunt us.
Yeah, I think Anita Lane died just before I read the book, and so I was thinking about her a lot as I read it.
Well, she's a very important figure. I mean, Anita Lane was Nick's, great love in that period of time, from the Boys Next Door through the birthday party and the first rush of his totally formative solo career with the Bad Seeds in Berlin. And, you know, they were connected for life. She styled him, made his clothes, inspired him, influenced his painting, co-wrote music with him, also inspired collaborators like Mick Harvey and Blixa Bar-Geld, made a series of great albums herself. She was the one person that I regret not being able to speak to. She didn't want to speak to me. Nick tried on my behalf. Friends that I made during the writing of the book that were close to her also tried on my behalf. I messaged her a few times, but I didn't want to harass her. And in the end, I had to depend on Nick's descriptions of her, Dawn Cave, Nick's mother, telling me things about her, other band members and people who knew her, and in a sense, her elusiveness and resistance to being kind of chewed up by Nick's mythology made, I think, the picture of her in some ways both stronger and more mysterious at the same time, and she remained her own person. So I tried to respect that. One of the things I'm most proud of in the book, I have to say, is that a lot of the depictions of different women on the scene. I feel I was the first person to really even bother to speak to a lot of these people, you know, and to recognise their contribution to the cultural moment and the way they sort of influenced Nick. And the other thing, just more generally about people in the book, is not everybody in the book loves Nick, quite the opposite. So you're getting a lot of varied sort of viewpoints. It's not a hagiography in that sense, even though there's a lot of respect for Nick. There's a lot of friction as well, and that makes the story more interesting. I wanted to have where possible, a kaleidoscopic effect where Nick would tell a version of the story, and there might be 2 or 3 competing visions of what was actually going on. And that was kind of exciting to kind of play with too. But yeah, Anita Lane was a pretty important person, and I'm glad that I was able to acknowledge and recognise her as best I could in the book, and catch a little of her contribution, which was pretty critical.
So I'm moving, and I ran across this, which I totally forgot that I had.
Yeah.
And it's the I don't know if you remember when Henry Rollins had his publishing company.
Yep, of course.
1361. And I forgot. I read this when I was working as a young bookseller at Tower Records, and it sort of floored me. I had not read anything like that. It was early 90s.
Yeah.
And I went back and gave it another shot a couple years later, and it was beautifully bleak. It's hard to make that transition from being a songwriter to you know, there aren't many people who tried to do both, you know, write songs and also write novels, and I thought it was pretty incredible.
Look, he writes the Ass or the Angel in his mid to late 20s, right? It is clearly heavily, one could say too heavily influenced by William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor. So there's like it is dense going, but the ambition in the book to create an entire other world in the deep south of America, this kind of gothic horror story that is so over the top. There are elements of comedy in it, of a very kind of black and horrific nature. But for someone like Nick at that point in his life to create something like that, rather than just a kind of druggy memoir type thing, which would have been much more available, but to sort of reimagine a whole lot of things and place them in this mythical context, and it just tells you what a promising and great artist Nick already was, and how much he was willing to push himself. And actually, and the Ass or the Angel obviously dovetailed with The Firstborn is Dead and a bunch of other songs across that early solo period. And again, in Boy on Fire, like Nick talks about that a bit, because he says he regrets not just making it about Wangaratta and his boyhood there. And I can understand that regret. I think it probably would have been a better book for it, less hyped up, less pretentious in some respects. But at the same time, if he didn't have the ambition he had, if he wasn't kind of attaching himself to a whole lot of his literary heroes, then he wouldn't have been able to become the artist and musician he was. So it's one of those ones where its reach is greater than its grasp, but it certainly tells you, hey, this guy has got big ambitions.
Anybody else? Any questions?
No.
Thanks for showing us the book, Grace. Held her copy up.
You know, people talk about how long the book took me. We were discussing it before we came online, and it took about 10 years to come out. But really, it probably only took me more like 5-6 years. And there was a very messed up phase in the middle, relationship breakup, struggling to keep up because Nick is such a hyper productive artist, not just only across music, but film, books, soundtracks. It's just never ending. It's just incredible, his work ethic. And I had a lot of trouble convincing the first publisher that I was connected to about doing a portrait of the artist as a young man. So the book was kind of locked away in a lot of respects. And then I was able to kind of get back my work, and refine it and work with a new publisher, which was HarperCollins, and then of course Alan Unwin, Atlantic Books, who were taking care of the book USA UK along with you all, and do what I originally wanted to do, which was a portrait of the artist as a young man. And I think in the process of writing the book, I was, all biographies are quasi-autobiographies to some extent too. You're writing to explain your own life to yourself as much as the life that you're looking at. I think I mentioned that Da Vinci quote in there, the portrait painter always paints himself. So I was looking to unravel a few kind of my own mysteries, as much of those of Nick. And at the same time, trying to be aware of not projecting too much of that onto Nick's own story, but to be conscious of why I was connecting so strongly to it, particularly the tale of his boyhood and teenage years, his youth. So it was a real battle to get through. And I still remember Nick would call me late at night when I'd kind of smashed out of things, and it would be like midnight, and I'd been drinking and was pretty chaotic. And we would talk for like an hour, man. And I'd be looking for bits of paper because I wasn't expecting him to ring me. And he was only ringing me to kind of, well, he'd say, how's that fucking book going, Mordue? And usually I'd come up with some half-assed explanation, which was only half true of true at all, because, it wasn't really going anywhere. But the nice thing was, that Nick, I believe, was just concerned, not just for the book, but for my own well-being. So I can only say nice things about Nick, and that he was a very decent, supportive person when I was having a really difficult time with it. And even though we sort of argued about the book later on after his son died, because he wanted me to not do it, he had a change of heart. And that was just when I was getting everything back together again. I can only say good things. And in the end, Nick was happy with the book. He let me know that he liked it. So the final outcome, after a 10-year difficult journey for me and for him for his own reasons, was to sort of come out of a sort of massive biography project with mutual respect, pretty intact. And I think most biographers will know that that kind of outcome is actually surprisingly rare. So hopefully we'll last another round with volume 2. But yeah, Nick's a good guy.
I gotta think that the second half of his life is a bit more squirm-inducing and harder to navigate, but maybe not.
Well, there's more than a second half. I mean, Nick's like a cat. There's like 9 lives. I think I might have got through 2, and maybe I'll get through 3 or 4 more in volume 2, but I'm not going to get the whole 9. I've got to live too, so maybe I'll dip out on Nick on his 6th life and just leave the rest to him. Anyway, yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. This has been great. Really, I love the book, and it was great to talk to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it all.
Thanks, Mark. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, with a bit of luck, I'll actually, be there in the flesh, one day. Yeah.
You're always welcome.
Yeah, that would be great. We'd love to have you.
Love to go to Chicago. Nelson Algren, one of my favorite writers, is from Chicago. Big fan. Changed my life. Yeah.
I shared that email with everyone. That was great.
Yeah, that was pretty great.
Yeah. He was huge in my 20s. Changed my mindset. You actually, in a funny way, another influence on Boy on Fire, the young Nick Cave, Nelson Algren, for sure, because I wouldn't be the writer I am without his work.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks everybody for coming.
Take
Have a
care.
good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.